Okay, there we go. We are now live. So, good afternoon, everyone. So excited to see you all here, ready to learn about the amazing Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary and the coral in the Gulf of Mexico off the Texas coast. I'm Anna Farrell-Sherman. I'm a Clean Water Associate with Environment Texas, which is a statewide advocate for clean air, clean water, and open spaces. My work is generally focused on advocating for nature-based infrastructure, features like rain gardens, green roofs that help stormwater slow down and soak into the soil to prevent flooding, drought, and water pollution. But today, the water that we're going to talk about is a little bit bigger than a raindrop. We're going to go further south into the Gulf of Mexico and talk about the ocean off the Texas coast. I have always loved the ocean. Actually, some of my very first words I learned on the beach with my dad were crab and wow. I've learned a couple more words at this point, but I still really find the ocean awe-inspiring and beautiful, and I think that we all do. And that's part of why I was so excited for this event and to partner with the Turtle Island Restoration Network, the Coastal Bend branch of the Surfrider Foundation, and EarthX on this webinar today. We're hoping to teach you something about the amazing ocean off the Texas coast, tell you about NOAA's proposal to triple the size of the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary, and tell you more about how to protect this amazing ecosystem. We're very lucky to have GP Schmahl, Superintendent of the Flower Garden Banks Sanctuary himself, on this webinar to teach us about this very special place. But I'm not actually going to give the official introduction. For that, I'd like to turn it over to Joanie, who is the Gulf Program Director of the Turtle Island Restoration Network. And she runs the Gulf Coast Sea Turtle Action Center and helps protect sea turtles off our coast, and is going to be introducing our speaker today.
Thank you, Anna. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. As Anna said, I'm Joanie Steinhaus, Turtle Island Restoration Network. We're an ocean conservation organization, and in 2019, we celebrated 30 years of ocean conservation advocacy, research, and working with communities to protect the watershed in our ocean. And as Anna said, the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary is our treasure. It's about 110 miles off the coast of Louisiana and Texas, and we are thrilled that we have GP Schmahl with us today to do a presentation on the proposed expansion. GP has been superintendent of the sanctuary since March of 1999, and prior to that, he worked 8 years in the Florida Keys Sanctuary. So we want to give him plenty of time. He's going to talk to you about the process, the proposed expansion, and give you some background information. Anna will be monitoring the chat room, so if you have any questions, please type them in. And if it's relevant to a particular slide that GP's on, we'll interrupt his presentation and ask your question. And then we'll also leave a little bit of time at the end for questions. So thank you again for everyone for being here. Thank you, GP, for being here. And we're going to turn it over to you for your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Joanie. Thank you, Anna. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this today. And I will, again, my name is GP Schmahl. I am the superintendent of the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary. I work for NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, who administers the National Marine Sanctuary Program. And my office is based out of Galveston, Texas. And there's a NOAA lab in Galveston that includes both the National Marine Fisheries Service and our office of the National Marine Sanctuary Program. And so I'm going to kind of jump right into it, I think, and turn my screen on. And Anna, if you can tell me to make sure that it's showing correctly, that would be great.
Yes, you're showing correctly.
Okay. So this is, so I'm going to talk about the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary. And I have to say that even people in Texas sometimes are not familiar with it. It's an area that is offshore of the coast and far enough offshore that it is outside the range of accessibility by most people. And so for that reason, it a lot of people don't know about it, and many people have not been out there, and you'll see why in a moment. The picture on the screen right here is taken from an area that is in the deeper water areas around the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary, and I'll be talking a little bit about that today. I want to start. Okay, I thought I was going to start with a little bit of background, as I'm not sure what the level of knowledge of everyone on this call is with the National Marine Sanctuary Program, but this is a national program. We have 14 National Marine Sanctuaries around the country in the waters of the United States and in associated territories, including American Samoa. And from this map, you can see that they're spread around throughout the coastal areas of the United States, including in the Great Lakes. There is an existing sanctuary called Thunder Bay in Lake Huron in the Great Lakes. And the sanctuaries range from Stellwagen Bank up in the northeast off of Massachusetts down to the Florida Keys, several on the west coast from the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary up to the Olympic coast in the state of Washington, and including a couple in Hawaii, including the Hawaiian Islands Humpback Whale National Marine Sanctuary and the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument. And like I mentioned, the National Marine Sanctuary of American Samoa. So there's quite a range of habitats. We like to compare ourselves in some ways to the National Park Service. These are like parks, except they're underwater for the most part, and administered through NOAA, through the Department of Commerce rather than the Department of Interior. The Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary is the only National Marine Sanctuary in the Gulf of Mexico. So the National Marine Sanctuary Program is administered by the National Marine Sanctuaries Act, and the purpose of the Act is to identify and designate as National Marine Sanctuaries areas of the marine environment and Great Lakes, which are of special national significance. But there's an important proviso as part of our program, is that we also are charged with facilitating, to the extent compatible with the primary objective of resource protection, public and private uses. So it's a compatible use kind of program. And we do allow for use of the sanctuary, and therefore sometimes the word sanctuary connotes an idea of total protection. That's not totally true, because this is a multiple use program. In the Flower Garden Banks is, we'll zoom in on it just a little bit more. It's located, as Joanie said, off the coast of Texas and Louisiana. If you drew a line directly south of the Texas-Louisiana border, you would run into the kind of right between the east and west Flower Garden Bank, located about 100 miles offshore. And the sanctuary was designated in 1992, and then as the East and West Flower Garden Bank, and then in 1996, an additional feature called Stetson Bank was added to the sanctuary, and it's located about 70 miles off the coast of Texas. The reason the sanctuary was, or the East and West Flower Garden Banks was designated primarily, was because of the incredible coral reefs that occur there. And many people aren't aware that luxuriant coral reefs occur off the coast of Texas. But the reason for this is that it's far enough offshore that it's outside of the influence of direct coastal runoff. There is not a lot of sedimentation and pollutants that come off the coasts of Texas, Louisiana. As you know, the Mississippi River drains about 40% of the landmass of the mainland U.S., and most of that gets dumped into the in the Gulf of Mexico, creating an annual dead zone and other host of problems. But if you get far enough offshore, the warm, clear waters that are brought up from the Caribbean that come up through a current that's known as the Loop Current into the Gulf of Mexico brings this clear water, and it allows areas like this to have become established. The coral reefs at the Flower Garden banks are surprisingly some of the healthiest coral reefs, certainly in the Western Atlantic and Caribbean region. It's, as you probably know, coral reefs are in trouble, big trouble worldwide. In the Caribbean is no less than anywhere else. Coral reefs of the Caribbean have shown declines of up to 30% or more in the last 10 to 20 years. But because of the isolation, because of the unique location of the Flower Garden banks, the corals are, at least right now, maintaining their level of health, and have done so since the first monitoring programs that were established in the late 1980s. So again, the Flower Garden banks include the northernmost coral reefs in the continental United States, located about 100 miles offshore and about 56 square miles in size. And the water depths range from about 17 meters at the shallowest point. That's where the primary coral reefs are, down to about 152 meters on the surrounding areas of the banks. So it is a national sanctuary, and there are regulations involved. Most of those regulations are designed to protect the bottom features, to protect those coral reef features and associated habitats. And most of the regulations are therefore directed at things that would impact the bottom. So anchoring is obviously a big one, and anchoring is prohibited within the National Marine Sanctuary. Discharges of most sorts, are prohibited with certain exceptions. There are exceptions to allow for release of chum and that kind of thing for permitted fishing activities, for vessel deck washdown and that kind of thing. Taking coral or any kind of invertebrate or really any kind of feature really from the sanctuary is prohibited. But as I mentioned, it is we do allow certain uses, and fishing is allowed, but only by what's known as conventional hook and line. So any kind of fishing that impacts the bottom, like traps, trawls, bottom long lines, that kind of thing is prohibited. But the Flower Garden banks are only, and Stetson Bank are only 3 of what are dozens of reefs and banks that occur along the edge of the continental shelf in the Gulf of Mexico. And so this is kind of color-coded from shallow to deep. Starts red indicates shallower waters, while blue is deeper waters. And you can, as you can see, the continental shelf in this part of the Gulf of Mexico extends out from the shoreline for quite a distance, depending on where you are. But then it reaches a point, as you can clearly see, where there's that distinct line that it breaks off from the red grading to yellow down to the blue into the deep part of the Gulf of Mexico. And right along the edge of that drop off is this series of features, underwater features that we call reefs and banks. And they range from the Flower Garden banks to the west, all the way to the east, to almost to the Mississippi Delta. What we are talking about now, with the main reason for this presentation, is that we have a proposal that we would expand the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary by adding 14 additional, or portions of 14 additional banks to the east of the existing sanctuary. So in this map, the existing sanctuary, those indicated in red, like I mentioned before, the east and west Flower Garden Bank and Stetson Bank. And then to the east, you can see a number of areas indicated in white. And these are the proposed boundaries that we have suggested as being added to the Flower Garden Banks. And I'm going to go into that expansion proposal in a bit of detail in a moment. I'll also note that these banks, many of them have names that were given to them back in the 1970s and 1980s, and a lot of those names are essentially are people who were first discovered these areas and researched these areas in that time frame in the 1970s, 1980s, and many of those were scientists, professors from Texas A&M. About banks and adding banks and flower garden banks. And then finally somebody said, well, what do you mean when you say bank? And so I forget sometimes that that's not a real common term for people. And so this is an underwater a view of the bottom in the vicinity of the flower garden banks. And so a bank is essentially any kind of feature that rises up around the surrounding seafloor. In that map that I showed earlier, the continental shelf, for the most part in the Gulf of Mexico, is quite flat. It's mostly soft sediment, mud and sand for the most part. But when you get to this area near the edge of the continental shelf, you have a number of these features that protrude out of the surrounding seafloor, making these features that we call banks. And banks is basically a maritime term for any kind of feature that rises up out of the bottom, but is not tall enough to be a hazard to navigation, which is the official definition of a reef. A reef is something that you can run your boat aground on, where a bank is something that's a feature, but it's relatively deep. And so when I talk about banks, that's what I'm talking about. It's just these underwater, they're almost like the mini mountains that come up out of the seafloor in the Gulf of Mexico. And it's actually very interesting the way these areas were formed. They're actually salt domes. You may have heard that term for other areas, but what it is that there's a deep layer of underlying salt in the Gulf of Mexico, shown by the purple area in this diagram. This is if you were looking from a side view of the underneath the seafloor, and those areas at the very top is the seafloor. And so you have this underlying salt that's pushing up over time, pushing up these features and making this topography on the seafloor in the areas that we know now as banks. And you may be familiar with salt dome features. If you're perhaps from this part of Texas, you may be familiar with the area known as High Island. It's over on the Bolivar Peninsula. And on this map, you can see this circular feature. I have my cursor going around. I don't know if you see my cursor, but the thing labeled as High Island is a very distinctive circular feature. And that actually is also formed by a salt dome. It also happens to be a very important in bird rookery. And many people go there. I think I think roseate spoonbills and a number of other birds are nesting there right now. But I digress. What we have been doing at the Flower Garden Banks for a number of years now is investigating these other topographic features, these other banks. And we do this in a variety of ways. The first step is to map these features, and you map them by ship, of course, using what's known as multi-beam bathymetry. It's just a really fancy depth finder that records what the bottom features look like, and then you can pull it all together and make a very detailed map out of it. Once you make that map, you can then go and see what's down there. And we use, because these areas are too deep in most cases to scuba dive, we use remotely operated vehicles, sometimes submersibles and other equipment to find out what it is on the bottom. And some of these features are very complex. This just happens to be one from Alderdice Bank, who is one of the areas that is being proposed for the expansion. And you can see those really tall peaks on the left-hand portion of this feature. And those kinds of things, and this is like you see anywhere really, when you have structure like that, especially if it's hard bottom structure, around what is predominantly soft bottom, you get a lot of sea life attracted to it. And so on these rocky features have colonized a number of coral communities. And these are different than the corals that occur at the flower garden banks, because the flower garden banks is shallow enough that what they call true coral reefs have developed. So these are the stony corals or the reef building corals. When you get deeper than that, deeper than about 50 meters or so, there's not enough light coming down into the seawater to support true coral reef development. But you have a whole variety of other types of corals that colonize on rocky features, as seen in this in some of these photographs. These are primarily what are known as black corals and octocorals, and so wherever you have rocky features, especially where you have organisms that have attached to the seafloor, you also attract all sorts of fish and other marine animals. And so these are essentially biodiversity hotspots in the Gulf of Mexico because of those communities that have developed. And I'll just say that in this photograph, or this image, kind of going from the upper right-hand corner, you'll see this is a photograph taken from Bright Bank, which is quite near the flower garden banks. You can see that there's still a lot of light at this depth. There's a lot of green in there because there's algae, and of course algae needs light in order to grow. As you go down deeper, down to the lower right, the example from Geyer Bank, you kind of lose the algae, but you see still some types of coral that are growing there. You can this is mostly fire coral on that particular photograph. A lot of tropical fish, a lot of fish in general. On the upper left, you're getting deeper still, and that is primarily typified by black coral communities, and those orange things that look kind of like sea fans are actually black corals, and black corals are not always black. In fact, they're usually never black. They're named black corals because the skeleton underneath the living organism is black. And in the old days, that's the only way scientists saw these things, were in a jar full of alcohol and not live like they are in this photograph. And then even deeper still, in the lower left-hand corner, you get to where the light is almost diminished to the point where there's very little light at all. And you get a different type of community, but includes a variety of other types of black corals, types of solitary stony corals, and sponges of various sorts. So these are very important communities, but not well known by many people, just because they're kind of one of those things that are out of sight, out of mind.
Hey,
So
GP.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Could you give us the depths of each of these pictures? We had a question in the chat about it. What are the actual, as you're saying deeper and deeper, but what are the usual depths? Right.
Okay, so I don't know the exact depth of these particular pictures, but in general, like the Bright Bank up in the upper right is probably about 40 to 40 meters or so, 120 feet, 140 feet, something like that. Down to Geyer Bank, that's probably in the range of 150 to 200 feet. Alderdice Bank up in the upper left is in the range of 300 to 350 feet, and Elvers Bank in the lower left-hand corner is probably in the 400 to 500 foot depth range. So now I'm going to go kind of in the history of what this expansion proposal actually is. This all started, every National Marine Sanctuary was required to have a management plan, and we were required to review and revise our management plan as appropriate from time to time. Way back in 2007, we started a process to revise our management plan, and at that time, one of the things that came out in the public comment period and the interest in general was the fact that we should consider expanding the existing sanctuary to a larger area. And in fact, in our management plan that we published in 2012, it included a sanctuary expansion action plan. And we actually put in our management plan that we will go forward with to assess the the feasibility of expanding the sanctuary and coming up with a proposal for that. We did do that, and in 2015 we published what was called a notice of intent, and that was an official notice to people that we are now initiating an official process to start that expansion. And as you can see, that was in 2015. So we did that. And in 2016, in June of 2016, we released our proposal for expansion and a draft environmental impact statement. And in that proposal, we evaluated a number of potential alternatives for expansion. And it ranges, I'm sure if you're familiar with federal actions, this is the typical way it's done is that the federal agency will propose something in terms of a range of alternatives. And typically if they're from a, it's usually called as a no action alternative, which is the status quo up to and including various levels of, in this case, expansion. So we did that, and we had actually 5 alternatives. I'll show you the three of them. And one, of course, is the no action alternative, which is the existing sanctuary. That's the East and West Flower Garden Bank and Stetson Bank, as I mentioned before. We had a kind of a middle alternative, which was our alternative 3, and also identified as our preferred alternative, which we identified 15 additional banks in 8 polygons. Some of the banks were combined into single polygons and would expand the sanctuary from 56 square miles to 383 square miles. We also considered a even larger alternative that would look at a broader geographic range, and this was our alternative 5. And as you can see, not only did it include the reefs and banks of the northwestern Gulf of Mexico that we've been speaking of until now, it also included a number of areas off to the east, including areas east of the Mississippi Delta. And that area, some of those areas in that region are known as the Pinnacles off of Mississippi, Alabama. Very important bank features of them in their own right, a very important fishing locality. And we also included a number of spots that were in deeper waters on the continental slope, off the continental shelf.
GP, I'm going to interrupt you with a couple more questions.
Sure.
You talked to us about the depth. Can you tell us how high off the seafloor the banks are?
Yeah, so that ranges. And so the surrounding water depth in the area of where I was describing before ranges from about 400 feet to about 600 feet. And then these features rise up to, in some cases, like at the Flower Garden banks, they rise up within 60 feet of the sea surface. In other of the areas, and which is more typical of the areas that we were looking at for expansion, they rise up within about 150 to 200 feet of the sea surface. So they have several hundred feet of elevation from the surrounding seafloor in total.
Excellent. And then we have 2 similar questions. You talked about some activities that are permitted, and they're asking who regulates these activities.
So the National Marine Sanctuary has regulations of our own that we have promulgated, and we are proposing to promulgate or apply to these expanded areas. And those are the things like the no anchoring that I mentioned, the use and possession of certain fishing gear, discharges of pollutants and other material, that kind of thing. And we can enforce those directly. Now we enforce those primarily through the U.S. Coast Guard and the NOAA Office of Law Enforcement. So we don't have our own enforcement arm at the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary, but these regulations can be enforced by any designated law enforcement officer that has, ability to enforce federal regulations. And some of the states have that ability too, and both Texas and Louisiana have the ability to enforce federal laws in the offshore areas, even outside of state waters. Now, a number of these other, activities are also regulated by other federal agencies. Of course, the fishing regulations that are generated by the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council, of course, apply throughout the Gulf, including the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary, unless there's more restrictive regulations within the sanctuary. So things like bag limits, size limits, seasonal restrictions for certain species of fish, of course, those are all apply throughout this area. In terms of oil and gas development, primary agency that regulates oil and gas is the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management, used to be known as the Minerals Management Service. And they have a variety of regulations that are designed to protect sensitive features, that sort of thing. So there is several layers of entities that regulate these types of activities in the Gulf of Mexico. Did that answer that question?
Yes, thank you very much. We have a few more, but we'll let you continue.
Okay. So we went through a public comment period at that after the release of the draft environmental impact statement, and we received quite a few comments. In fact, we received over 8,000 comments in various categories, and we had what I feel is overwhelming support for sanctuary expansion in general, and most people, or very many people, expressed support for the larger alternatives. I will note that in our draft EIS, we noted that the larger alternatives were the most environmentally strongest and most beneficial alternatives. But the reason we went with the more moderate expansion was essentially based on the ability that we felt that we had to manage these areas under the existing framework, existing budgets, ability of our staff and infrastructure. So that was the main reason why we went with a more moderate alternative as the preferred alternative. There were some opposition to the expansion, and for the most part, that came from the oil and gas industry. And I'll get into that a little bit more. But again, this is just a snapshot. There's a lot, the public comment, and I also will point out that when a federal agency takes public comment, it's just not just about the numbers. It's a variety of other factors go into how an alternative is evaluated, besides just simply on the public input. So that kind of gets us where we are now. What we have done, since the draft environmental impact statement in 2016, we have taken the public comment. We have worked extensively with our Sanctuary Advisory Council. We have an advisory council, as do all national marine sanctuaries, that are comprised of representatives of what we feel are the major constituent stakeholder groups in this area. And so we went through a process with our advisory council to evaluate what we had proposed in our draft EIS, taking the public comment into account, and what resulted was a modification of our preferred alternative, which I'll show you in one second. So this is out on the street right now. It was published officially on May the 1st, and that, of course, is published in the Federal Register, and that's where the official proposal is. And it opened a public comment period that people can make comments on a website called regulations.gov. That's the official portal for people to submit their comments and opinions on this proposal. We, again, in a snapshot, there are portions of 14 additional reefs and banks for a total of 160 square miles, which represents a 104 square mile increase in size, and that we would apply the existing regulations from the Flower Garden banks to these new areas. We are taking public comments through July the 3rd, and we have scheduled 3 virtual public meetings because of the coronavirus issue. It was not advisable to have in-person meetings, and so these public meetings will be held virtually via webinar. There are going to be 2 of them on June the 8th, which is coming up soon, one in the afternoon and one in the evening, and then a follow-up evening public meeting on June the 11th. And I can certainly get that information to for anyone who is interested to log in just to listen or to make public comment. And of course, you can always make public comments directly to through the portal at regulations.gov, or you can do it the old-fashioned way and write a letter and send it to address it to me at the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary. And all that information is in the Federal Register notice. It's on our website and other venues. One thing I'll point out that in this proposed rule, we are asking for additional input on 3 areas. First is the boundary configurations that we have come up with. And that's because they have changed since the preferred alternative that we published in 2016. And then we've got 2 comments that came through various sources that we would like additional comments on. One is from the highly migratory species fishery regulation entity for NOAA to exempt the possession of pelagic longline gear in these expanded areas. And there's also been a proposal both by the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council and our advisory council to provide an exemption for spearfishing gear in the expanded sanctuary. I'll just note that we are asking for specific input on that, although people can comment on any aspect of the expansion proposal during this period. I'll just note on our website, you can there's a lot of information there. You can get a copy of the Federal Register notice, which is just a screenshot for what a Federal Register notice looks like on the left. We have a variety of fact sheets and information as noted on the fact sheet on the right-hand side of this slide. We have created a document that has taken each of those 14 additional features and put them in a document that provides some specific information about each of those bank features, where the proposed boundaries are being proposed, and what some of the typical biological communities that are associated with those bank features, that you can take a look at and get a better idea of what kind of biological communities are involved in this expansion proposal. So this is what the changes look like. The areas that are noted in purple are the boundaries that were proposed in the 2016 preferred alternative in the draft environmental impact statement. And the white areas designated in white, are what is being proposed now in this notice of proposed rulemaking. And you can see that those areas in most cases have been reduced in size. And the primary reason for that is the input and interaction that we had with both the commercial fishing interests and oil and gas interests. I'll show you a graphic in a minute of the amount of oil and gas activity there is in this area, but I'm sure everyone is familiar that this is one of the most highly developed areas for exploration and recovery of offshore oil and gas resources in the world. And there are literally thousands of oil and gas platforms in this part of the Gulf of Mexico and thousands of miles of pipelines. And we went to great effort to try to minimize the impact of the oil and gas industry in this proposal. And as always, there are compromises there. Oh, that's the same map, except with the, so there is a reduction from 383 square miles that we had proposed in 2016 to 160 square miles in this notice of proposed rulemaking. These areas, as I mentioned, are very sensitive to a variety of impacts. I want to kind of just generally go over those types of impacts right now. One thing is that there is evidence of the offshore industry in this vicinity. You can see there's just a discarded barrel, some other kind of debris. There's a cable in the lower left that we believe is it's an old seismic cable. These pictures are taken from McGrail Bank. There's still evidence of some recent anchoring. As you can see, there's actually a submersible making surveys in the upper right. These areas are right off of a major shipping lane in this part of the Gulf of Mexico, and you can imagine the amount of traffic of large ships going in and out of the port of New Orleans, back and forth from Mexico into the Caribbean. Anchoring is a huge concern. These pictures are actually taken from the dry Tortugas, but those types of ships are the same kinds of ships that are plying the waters right off of these areas in the Gulf of Mexico. And that picture shows you the size of an anchor for a ship of this size, which is about a 1,000-foot ship, which is very typical in the shipping industry. And you can imagine the damage that anchoring can do for in just a few moments in these kinds of sensitive communities. And this just shows an incidence of anchoring at Geyer Bank. This is one of the areas that are being proposed of a ship being anchored there at that time. That's one of the things that we feel is important as a National Marine Sanctuary program. Like I mentioned, there's several other entities that regulate certain activities, but there's other things that fall through the cracks. For example, in this area is actually considered as a habitat area of particular concern by the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council. And so fishing vessels are not allowed to anchor there. It's also has been identified as a no activity zone by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And so oil and gas vessels cannot disturb the seafloor or anchor there. But yet there's no regulation that prevents a freighter like this ship in this photograph to anchor in this location. So we feel that the National Marine Sanctuary Program would bring a comprehensive management regime to these areas that can address all types of impacts, not just specific ones. We do see some impacts of fishing gear throughout these areas. Up in the upper left-hand corner at Stetson Banks, there's still some remnants of old shrimp nets there. We do see bottom long lines, anchor lines, that kind of thing. And this, of course, is what one of the things that we would want to prevent by establishing these areas as a national marine sanctuary. As you can see, I mean, these areas are prime areas for fish species in their various life stages. This is where they go to spawn many species, and where they settle out as young juveniles and grow up. And many of these species are of extreme importance for the commercial and recreational fishery in the Gulf of Mexico. So not only is there a biological importance to protecting these areas, but there is economic importance to them as well. I mentioned oil and gas activity. This is just a graphic of the number of oil platforms in the Gulf of Mexico, in the northern Gulf of Mexico. They're actually, a lot of them are being removed at this time. There was up to around 3,000 oil and gas platforms just a few years ago, and a number of them have been removed as they come to the end of their useful life. But there's still close to 2,000 or so oil and gas platforms in the Gulf of Mexico. And on this graphic, I also showed where the Deepwater Horizon incident happened. It was off the coast of Louisiana, Mississippi. And as you can see, it was quite a ways away from the Flower Garden banks, which are the two red circles on the sort of the extreme left-hand side of this map. And so luckily, we did not see any direct physical impact from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. But as time goes on, as you probably know, there has been a lot of less subtle or more subtle impacts that are being discovered as time goes on. And there is still some concern that some of these areas have been impacted by that oil spill.
We actually had two questions about oil fields and the sanctuary. One is, how close are oil fields? And the second one is, was there any thought about including those Deepwater Horizon disaster areas in the protected areas to help them recover?
Yes. Unfortunately, I don't have a map showing a zoom in around the Flower Garden banks, for example, to show locations of the existing infrastructure for oil and gas activity, but they are all around most of these features that are being proposed for expansion. In fact, there was an oil platform, an operating oil platform that was incorporated inside the boundary of the East Flower Garden Bank when it was designated as in 1992. Our regulations actually allow for certain types of oil and gas exploration in the sanctuary, as long as they're outside of the previously designated no activity zones and comply with other pretty stringent regulations. And so that particular platform was less than a mile from the East Flower Garden Bank. There are approximately within a 10-mile radius of the Flower Garden banks. I know that there are probably on the order of 15 to 20 oil and gas platforms. And as far as the terms of the reserves, of the actual oil fields, those are relatively well mapped for this part of the Gulf of Mexico, and they occur throughout this whole region. The other thing that I should mention about salt domes is that salt domes are also prime areas where people look for oil and gas, because oil and gas, hydrocarbons tend to accumulate in these salt dome areas because they are trapped there by the thick layers of salt. And so many of these areas that are important because they're biologically sensitive are also prime locations for oil and gas resources, and therefore that's the reason why we had such quite extensive discussions related to that. And I'm sorry, what was the second question?
The second question was there any thought of
right,
Deepwater Horizon area?
Yes, in fact, that alternative 5 that I mentioned when I showed you the range of alternatives in 2016 actually included the physical remnants of the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig as incorporated into the National Marine Sanctuary. That was a little bit controversial, actually. We included in that alternative 5 a number of what's known as submerged cultural resources, shipwrecks primarily. There are a lot of really important shipwrecks in the Gulf of Mexico, ranging back to the very early days of exploration of this continent. And we included, I think, 7 or 8 of those in the proposal for alternative 5. We also included the wreck of the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig because it was a spill of national significance. It was a memorial, actually, for the people who lost their lives during that incident. And so the answer is yes, we did include that physical location of the Deepwater Horizon in that alternative for expansion. And speaking of that, I just wanted to kind of, probably familiar with this. This was a map of the surface location of oil after, from the Deepwater Horizon. And obviously it's concentrated around the actual impact site, but it did spread out for a wide range on the sea surface in this portion of the Gulf of Mexico. But as I mentioned again, where we are, the Flower Garden Banks, and the sort of the left-hand side of this map, we were fortunately outside of the range of the direct impacts of that surface oil. But because of the dispersants that were used in the Deepwater Horizon incident, there was a deep water plume that actually tracked sort of to the south and west. And so some of these areas on the continental slope were actually impacted by the oil spill, not from direct surface release, but from the dispersant release that accumulated and traveled in deep water currents to the west. And I think I just want to I want to stop it there because I know we're kind of running short on time, but there is so much more I could have talked about, but I tried to pick out a range of issues that you may be interested in. I encourage you to go on our website, flowergarden.noaa.gov, and we have a whole section on the expansion. Includes a lot of background information, includes photographs and some video of these areas. Also, there's a map feature on it. It's a geographic information system based kind of map, so you can actually go into there and scroll around, zoom in on particular bank features, and there are different layers that you can actually turn on. The existing oil and gas infrastructure, for example, where the shipping lanes are. We even have information about what some of the biological communities are, and the extent of the density of biological organisms and that kind of thing. And so it's kind of fun to play around with if you're familiar with kind of the Esri GIS mapping tools. You'd be very comfortable in maneuvering around in that map feature. So I encourage you to take a look at that as well. So that's what I have. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today, and you can certainly follow up with me directly, through Anna and Joanie, or you can find me, on our website, or find one of us, staff on our website, and direct any questions or concerns that you have to us, and also encourage you to comment on the proposal. And like I say, it's that public comment period is open through July the 3rd. So thank you very much.
Thank you, GP. So we're going to do a few more questions.
Yes, we have some really good questions from the audience. Thank you so much for sharing. It's so cool to see all the pictures, see how beautiful it is, and also hear about the ways in which the sanctuary is protecting all of these cool habitats in the Gulf. So one of the questions is climate change and ocean acidification having a large impact on these areas?
Short answer is yes. And that is probably an overriding issue. Of course, that applies everywhere in the world right now. And the Gulf of Mexico is not immune to that. You may have actually even seen some news stories that right now, this year, the waters of the Gulf of Mexico are as warm as they've ever been for this time of year. And it's typically kind of discussed in the terms of and that might spawn, more hurricane activity and that kind of thing. But it's also really bad news for coral reefs and other kinds of organisms. There's a phenomenon known as coral bleaching that I'm sure you've heard about. The Great Barrier Reef over the last, just in recent years, has had a series of back-to-back coral bleaching events that have killed a high percentage of living coral on the biggest coral reef in the world. And coral bleaching is directly caused by seawater temperature rise. And seawater temperature rise is absolutely associated with climate change. We have seen some bleaching at the Flower Garden banks. We had a fairly a serious one in 2016. Luckily, again, because our reefs are a little bit deeper and farther offshore, and that seems to happen later in the year than other places in the Caribbean, and so the water cooled off quickly enough, so there was not a lot of mortality. But really, as a manager of a coral reef kind of area, climate change is the biggest concern that we have. The question of what can we do about it as a sanctuary, that's a little less clear. We certainly can't pass a regulation, that only applies to a very small area in the Gulf. It's such a bigger issue. But it is incumbent upon us, I think, to at least at a minimum to raise awareness to this issue and to follow the science. We have temperature. We have thermometers, measuring the temperature of the water at the reef bank, and that have been in place since actually since the late 1980s. We have a very good record, and there is absolutely a significant increase in seawater, the rise of seawater temperature over that period. So, yes.
So VP, to follow up on that, your existing management plan, one of the questions is, will it apply to the expansion area, or will you come up with a new management plan?
The management plan will generally apply to the new areas. The first thing we have to do after the expansion happens is to revise our management plan to address some specific issues that will arise based on individual areas in the expansion area. But in general, the management approaches that we take for the existing sanctuary are also applicable to these expanded areas. And so the regulations I already sort of talked about, but the other types of things, like for example, at the Flower Garden banks, because we have an anchoring prohibition, we have installed mooring buoys out there. So that will allow people to tie up to the mooring buoy so they don't have to anchor, and it still allows access of those areas for recreational purposes, which we want. And so there are a certain number of the banks that are being proposed for expansion that will also be, we intend to install and maintain mooring buoys at those locations. Certainly the types of educational programs and other things that we applicable to those expanded areas. So the general management plan will apply immediately upon expansion, but we will be revising our management plan to address specific issues that come up related to that.
And will that include thinking about new endangered and threatened species that maybe are in areas that are not currently in the sanctuary, but are going to be in the sanctuary after it's expanded, or would be in if it was expanded?
That's a very interesting question. Because there's certain different levels of species that have been identified already as threatened and endangered. For example, we have several species of stony corals that have recently been designated as threatened. These are species of star coral that occur at the East and West Flower Garden Bank, also occur at certain other banks in this expansion area. There's not a whole lot of endangered species that have been designated in terms of coral, although I would argue that there needs to be. There's more animals that have been identified as threatened and endangered species that are the more kind of mobile pelagic animals. So sea turtles, of course, are important. They're threatened and endangered. We have shown at the Flower Garden banks that these are critical areas for loggerhead sea turtles, probably for hawksbill sea turtles as well, as primary, sites, foraging sites for the subadult level of loggerhead sea turtles. There were some sea turtles that were tagged, and followed over a course of a couple of years. And those sea turtles, which are not quite large enough to reproduce yet, but they're still fair-sized turtles, basically stayed at the Flower Garden banks for that period. They would range out, for tens of kilometers, but they would always return, and that's where they were hanging out. In fact, the people that were doing the study, those turtles you could go to this ledge, where they were first found and tagged, and they would come back to that same ledge and hang out there. So these are, they're utilizing these areas extensively. Just recently, the giant manta ray has been shown that studies that of course they roam all over the Gulf of Mexico, but the ones that we see at the Flower Garden banks are always really small. Manta rays can be huge, but the ones that we see are relatively small. And it was and that's because these are juveniles, or in some cases they're babies. And so it's been proposed, been totally nailed down yet, but it's proposed that these are nursery areas for manta rays, which are threatened species. And that, and so the same thing goes for other, wide-ranging animals like whale sharks and other types of animals. And so, because we've taken this approach that they're small areas that are separated by open ocean, obviously, to protect a species that's ranging throughout that range, you're not going to protect them just by designating small areas, but we hope that it will at least help in that regard. And certainly areas like the example I gave for loggerhead sea turtles, which are a critical area for a certain part of their life history, is will provide protection to, at least at those critical times of their lives. So yes, it's a mix of things, but we believe that marine protected areas like the National Marine Sanctuary Program can add to the protection of threatened and endangered species and marine mammals. We don't get that many marine mammals, actually. It's interesting. It's kind of rare to see dolphins that far offshore, but we have occasional visits by other types of marine mammals as well.
GP, as you expand the sanctuary, it will continue to be called the Flower Garden Banks?
The proposal as it stands right now, yes, it would be. That's something that didn't really come up, but you could certainly argue that maybe we should consider a different name or a more expansive name. But it was kind of curious that that really didn't come up as an issue. But you may certain other expansions that have happened in the sanctuary program have come along with a name change, and so we'd be open to that. But right now, the proposal is just to keep it as the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary.
Excellent. And are there any satellites that are used in these restricted areas for protection to monitor vessel anchoring or any other activities? Not
that are designated solely for that purpose. However, it's really interesting because, as you know, being on the advisory council, Joanie, that we have very little data on certain types of activities, and it's very difficult to know how many vessels are out there and what activities are involved with. But in recent years, there are a lot of commercial satellites that are out there that we can tap into, and we actually have a project right now working with another part of NOAA that's working with a company that provides satellite imagery, from not only on land but on the ocean. And we're hoping that we'll at least be able to get some information related to the number of vessels in the area and that kind of thing through that information. There are many vessels now. The commercial fishing vessels, for example, use what's known as a vessel monitoring system, VMS, that they're required to have on their boats. And we can get that information through the National Marine Fisheries Service. And then large vessels like, shipping ships and most other types of commercial vessels have what's known as AIS. And that is something that we can also tap into, which is basically a satellite-based, communication system to track vessel traffic throughout the world. And so we can get information from that too. So there's a variety of different sources that does involve satellite communications too, and which is improving our ability to monitor and manage these areas.
Very cool. So I think as maybe a good final question to wrap up our webinar today, who gives the final okay to expand, and what recommendations would you give people as they're kind of thinking about what kinds of comments they want to submit in this public comment period?
The way the process is set up under the National Marine Sanctuaries Act is actually it's something that's known it can be administratively designated. So in other words, it doesn't need congressional. It doesn't have to be congressionally designated, and it's basically the responsibility of the Secretary of Commerce, Department of Commerce, because as I mentioned before, NOAA is in the Department of Commerce, who makes essentially the final decision. about expansion. As you can imagine, there are a lot of entities that weigh in on this process, and certainly Congress does have a role. And there is a provision in our act that if that we have to advise the appropriate committees in the both in the House and the Senate side, and if they have if there's concern, then they can raise that concern, and it has to be addressed specifically. And so so while Congress doesn't have to specifically approve the sanctuary, they can make it either easy or hard depending on what they're hearing from their constituents. So so the simple answer is that this can be designated by the Secretary of Commerce. And as far as comments, I think I would just say that there's been a long process to getting where we are. That opinions showing support for the general idea are certainly welcome, because that's we hope that we have proposed something that is will result in a good thing. I understand from I think most people on this call are on the environmental side, and and I, as an environmentalist myself, would have liked to seen it bigger. But while those comments are certainly welcome as too, I will point out that this the proposal that we have on the books or out for review right now, I think is a very strong achievement, and something that can be based on for future action, and if we can.
Thank you so much.
I just any kind of comments are welcome, and I think it's really important for people to become engaged on it, and it shows the level of interest, and it gives more support for our program in general. I think people are truly supportive of the idea of marine protected areas, and that we need to do more to protect our oceans and marine areas.
And we have several questions that we weren't able to get to. So I just want to remind everybody that the website that you see, if you haven't checked it out, please do go to it. GP mentioned there's an amazing amount of information about the expansion. There's questions about the different sizes, the different proposals, the different alternatives, and how they compare to this current proposal that's out there for expansion. And all that information is available. And then some of the interactive map features, you can look at coral density, you can look at shipping lanes, you can look at oil activity. And so it's a really amazing resource. And so I wanted to apologize to everybody that had additional questions that we just don't have time to get to today. But as GP said in one of his slides, this expansion has had tremendous support, even for the largest alternative 5. So please, if you participated, go out there, explore a little bit on their website, and then do enter comments. It will go through July 3rd, correct, GP?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, awesome.
I just want to mention as well, we had one comment that, a lot of people have no idea these coral banks exist, and they're so cool. I mean, if you learned anything from this, I hope that you took away how cool these ecosystems are and how beautiful they are. And so share it with people. Tell people about how beautiful these places are, how they need protection, and that the National Marine Sanctuary is a really good way to protect them.
Absolutely. And there's questions. We are recording this, and Anna and Environmental Texas and Turtle Island Restoration Network will both have the link available so that you can share with others and refer back to it for any information or any additional questions. So GP, I wanted to thank you again. You do an amazing job, you and your staff, with the research you do and the protection that you offer for these beautiful banks out in the Gulf of Mexico. And thank you for your time today.
Thank you. I appreciate it. You're welcome. I'll take care.
All right, you too. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you so much.